If you have ever flipped through keyboard magazines from the 1980s, the full-page ads from Sequential Circuits surely caught your attention. One of the most iconic of these ads shows the Sequential Synth Wizard standing amongst the company's powerhouse lineup of synthesizers: the monophonic Pro 1, the revolutionary Prophet 5, the Polysequencer, the rare Prophet Remote, and the monstrous dual-manual Prophet 10.
Sequential's analog synthesizers changed the keyboard landscape forever. Prophet 5 sounds were suddenly all over the radio, and if you didn't own a Prophet 5, you were either on the wait list for one, or, like most of us, dreaming of being able to afford one. In this episode of Synth Wizards, we'll take a look at what made the Prophets so special, and we'll get the inside scoop from the company's founder, Dave Smith, who sadly passed away just weeks after we interviewed him. We'll also go on the hunt for a rare Prophet 10 so that we can add some electronics that give it a healthy sonic boost.
Here at Syntaur, we live to bring old synthesizers back to life. We find vintage keyboards wherever we can, and our crew restores them back to their original splendor. We also supply parts to tens of thousands of customers all around the world so that they can restore and repair their own keyboards. At our shop in Texas, we have on hand parts for the synths used by pros from the 1960s all the way to today's brand new keyboards. Our inside and out knowledge has made us known as the Synth Wizards.
Hi, I'm Dave Smith. I'm the founder of Sequential Circuits back in 1974.
In episode 12 of Synth Wizards, we saw that the Sequential Circuits Prophet 5 was one of the first synthesizers to have a battery inside. While that in itself doesn't seem like such a big deal, the reason it had a battery was that battery was there to keep power to the digital memory while the keyboard was turned off. Dave Smith was a pioneer in using digital circuitry to control analog synthesizers, and his blending of these two universes resulted in what is arguably one of the finest electronic instruments ever made, the Prophet 5. Smith came to the synthesizer world with an education in the brand new field of digital electronics, and his company first started out manufacturing synthesizer accessories.
I was selling the Model 800 digital sequencer to Model 700 programming unit that added programmability to Mini Moogs and ARP 2600s. I actually waited a little while before starting on a Prophet 5 design. I had the idea because I knew about the microprocessors. I also had heard via EMU guys, Dave Rossum, that this solid-state music chipset was coming out. So it seemed obvious to me. Well, got a VCO, got a filter, got some envelopes, got some VCAs, got a microprocessor, piece of cake.
Solid State Music, or SSM, had been developing a new set of integrated circuit chips, which created a huge stir in the synthesizer world. SSM made a chip that was a self-contained VCO, another that was a filter, a chip that was an envelope generator, another that was a VCA. In fact, there were about 20 chips altogether. And these could be combined in all sorts of configurations, making it much simpler to design a new synthesizer. Lots of electronics were still needed to tie the whole thing together, of course. But still, it was a huge step forward, as prior to this, synthesizer circuits were typically made from scratch, using discrete components. If you wanted an oscillator, for instance, you had to first design one, then obtain all the components to build it, put it together, test it, and refine it. The SSM 2030 oscillator chip reduced all of that to a single IC that sounded great and was easy to integrate into a synthesizer circuit. The designer of many of these SSM chips was Dave Rossum.
My name is Dave Rossum, and I was founder, and in 1984 my official title was Chief Wizard of EMU Systems.
Most people relate EMU systems to the emulator line of digital samplers, or perhaps to the classic drumulator, SP12 and SP1200 drum machines. But back in the 1970s, EMU was deep into analog synthesizers with a monstrous modular system on the market. And the fact that this company was just down the road from Sequential was an important coincidence in the history of synthesizers.
Dave was a digital designer and was unsure of his analog design skills. So long before the Prophet, Dave was coming over to EMU. He bought clock oscillators for his sequencers from EMU. So we were good friends from early on. Dave knew about the SSM chips being in design from the early days. Back then, EMU was, we were into modular systems and we were building the chips, but we really weren't into sort of the more mass market, which is what Dave wanted to pursue.
Smith's genius, perhaps more than anything else, was that he recognized the potential of assembling a synthesizer voice using the now available SSM chips. And he recognized that multiple voices could be easily combined into a polyphonic synthesizer. And this is the clincher, with a digital microprocessor directing all of the traffic. In other words, the synth would have the fat analog voices, but an onboard CPU would remember the settings of all of the front panel controls digitally, and would then be able to save presets, as well as help tune the oscillators if they drifted.
I started like maybe in spring of 1977, just started working on the design, and I pretty much did the whole thing. I designed the metal and the woodwork, the mechanical side. I laid out the circuit boards. I did the schematics. I wrote all the software, and that was an interesting process. I learned a lot, and I was still. It was kind of a big job for me. I was kind of maybe a little cocky about being able to actually pull it off, but I did breadboard one voice, just with some pots and and one of those old, whatever you call them, breadboard units, and it sounded pretty good. It sounded really good. So I knew that when I had 5 of those in a box with programmability, that it was going to be a pretty awesome instrument.
Pretty awesome indeed. And Dave Smith's creation can certainly be called one of the 7 deadly synths. But the journey from synthesizer design to synthesizer manufacturer was a bit of a wild ride, to say the least.
It was really hard because we had all this interest once we introduced it, and everybody wanted one. Out of the first 10 units, David Bowie, Rick Wakeman, Joe Zawinul, it was clear that this was going to be the next big thing, but we couldn't build them. We couldn't get enough parts. The parts didn't work very well. We'd get some envelope generators where they'd work fine until it warms up, and the release time would go from 40 seconds to 10 seconds or something. And, it was really frustrating. Plus, we were trying to grow the company. We didn't have investors, trying to find ways of paying for stuff, getting things done, and having all this pent-up demand that we couldn't serve. It was highly frustrating. So that's kind of the memories of what was going on back then. Just general craziness, working nonstop, 7 days a week, trying to get it done.
The 5 in Prophet 5 means it has 5 voices. In other words, it can play 5 notes at once. Each P5 voice is totally analog and is based on 2 oscillators, which can be slightly detuned for a fat sound or tuned in an interval. The filter sounds great, and it can produce biting resonance sweeps. Rear panel jacks allow you to use a control voltage source, like Syntaur's CVP-100 pedal, to control the volume or the filter cutoff, which is really nice for some hands-free control. The Prophet also has a polymod section, which just means that you can use multiple modulation sources together for more complex sound creation. A common mod routing is using an LFO, a low-frequency oscillator, to add vibrato or a slight wiggle in pitch. To do this, we'll set the LFO up with a triangle waveform because we want the pitch rising and falling smoothly. Next, we'll send the LFO to the mod wheel and assign it to modulate the frequency of both oscillator A and oscillator B. And that's what gives us a nice vibrato. But the polymod section gives us the chance to add much more complex modulations to a sound. For instance, we can borrow the filter envelope and use it to modulate the pitch of oscillator A. This is a great way to add a quick attack transient. And then we can also use oscillator B to modulate the pitch of oscillator A. This type of audio range frequency modulation can give some crazy metallic type sounds.
All in all, the Prophet 5 just has a very logical and musical voice architecture. Nothing too crazy, everything just practical and tidy.
As the Prophets began making their way into more and more keyboard rigs, Sequential began making some changes to improve the reliability of the synths. This led to several different revisions, or Revs, of the Prophet 5. The Rev 1 is the most rare Prophet 5, with 182 of them made. And while it's a common rumor that the Rev 1s were handmade by Dave Smith in his garage, that's just not the case. For one thing, the company didn't ever operate out of a garage. It started out in Dave's apartment, and then moved to a commercial space before the first Prophet 5 was ever made. And were they hand-built?
No, they were all built with the same assembly methods, as were the Rev 3s. Yeah, there were no big changes in there.
Manufacturing was done by a small team at Sequential's commercial space on Astor Avenue in Sunnyvale, California. The Rev 1s suffered from some reliability problems, which really stemmed from the fact that it was a brand new company learning how to set up a manufacturing operation.
The Sequential vibe way back was just crazy. We were all kids. We didn't, I was in my 20s. I didn't know what I was doing. None of us knew what we were doing. We made the mistake of doing all the manufacturing ourselves. So we had a small place initially, and then we, in 1980, I think, moved to a much bigger place in San Jose. And yeah, it was just crazy trying to, buying wave solder machines and figuring out how to build things and buying testers, these big Hewlett-Packard testing machines you put circuit boards on, and and we were all just learning how to do this stuff.
While all of the Prophet 5 models look basically similar, the telltale signs of the rare Rev 1 are the power switch on the top panel instead of on the back, and the power cord on the right side instead of on the left. I'm lucky enough to own one of the few Rev 1s, so when we had the opportunity to interview Dave Smith, I brought this one along and asked if he would autograph it. And for the sake of completeness, I later had Dave Rossum sign it as well. What a treasure this synth is. We keep it on display in the museum section of our showroom at Syntaur.
The Rev 2 is the most sought-after Prophet 5. After watching how the Rev 1s fared out in the wild, Smith made some circuit board changes to make things a little tidier and to make the overall package more robust. The power switch, power cord, and power supply board moved from the right side of the synth, where they were near the voice board, over to the left, and panel switches for tune and edit were added. Rev 1s and 2s both have a large Prophet 5 badge on the back panel. After Rev 2, this badge was much smaller. The Rev 2 also added the capability to save programs to cassette tape, and like its predecessor, it sounded monstrous. And with some luck on your side, it would keep on sounding monstrous without too many visits to the service center. Rev 2s are not easy to come by these days. There were 1,118 of them made, and those who have them aren't very inclined to let go of them. And when they do, they are priced thousands of dollars higher than the other Prophet 5s. The Rev 3 upgrade was a huge change. It was basically a redesign of the Prophet 5's voice circuitry, and the reason was twofold. For one thing, those SSM chips that made the whole concept of the Prophet 5 viable were having failure rates that were uncomfortably high. Many of the chips got rejected by Sequential even before being used, and those that did make it inside a synthesizer often were the cause of that synth having to visit a service center a bit too regularly. The other factor at play was that Sequential was paying a substantial royalty to EMU systems on every Prophet 5 that left the factory.
He did the digital design and asked us to do the entire analog design. So the analog design of the Prophet Rev 1 and 2 were really my personal designs. And for all that, he was paying a royalty per unit. Once he got into production, we did it all up front for free. So it was very much a collaboration, and we were happy to do it. He was a friend. We had a patent on the algorithms for the polyphonic keyboard, so that was part of the deal with the Prophet 5. We were getting paid a royalty, and some of that was for the licensing of our polyphonic keyboard patent, which we'd also licensed for the Oberheim 4 voice.
In 1979, a new company came onto the scene which offered their own line of synthesizer chips, Curtis Electromusic. The new CEM chips seemed to be more robust and less prone to failure than the SSM chips, and Sequential saw the possibility of eliminating two problems at once. If the Prophet 5 could be redesigned to use the new Curtis chips, not only would it be more reliable, it would also relieve Sequential of their obligation to pay royalties to EMU systems. It was too good of an opportunity to pass up, and Sequential began a complete redesign of the Prophet 5. The new Prophet Rev 3 was indeed more reliable, the tuning was more stable, and with royalty payments eliminated, a significant financial burden was lifted from Sequential. Additionally, the Rev 3 had the capacity to store 120 sound programs, and even MIDI could be added. But ultimately, players began to realize that the sound just wasn't quite as fat. The Curtis filters didn't have the same girthy sound of the earlier SSM filters. And that's why, despite being less reliable, the Rev 2 Prophet 5s command a considerably higher price than the Rev 3s.
The Prophet 5 was an amazing creation. I can clearly remember the very first note I ever heard from one in a studio in Baton Rouge back in 1978. What could be better than having a Prophet 5? Maybe having two Prophet 5s together? Let's take a look at the Prophet 10.
The backstory is that the very first units, first Prophet 5 units, you could buy either a 5-voice or a 10-voice. And the 10-voice had 2 voice cards, and the 5-voice had 1. And I think out of the first 10 units, 2 or 3 of them were 10 voices, and we sold a number of 10-voice units until we finally realized that it's just not reliable enough. There's too much heat in there, they break down a lot more. And so we had to stop building them, and we converted most of the existing 10s that were out there into Prophet 5s because it just didn't work. I screwed up. So after we started catching up with things, when we started working on the Rev 3 Prophet 5, which we had to do, we switched from the SSM parts to the Curtis parts because they were more reliable. So at that time we said, well, we should probably do a 10-voice now because we could do it more reliably. And then we got carried away and said, let's just make this huge boat anchor, double manual, sequencer-driven thing. So it turned out, I'm not sure how we, I think it just probably came from discussing, well, what would we do if we wanted to build this ultimate synth? So I think the development was kind of at the same time as the Rev 3s or right after the Rev 3s came out in 81 or 82, I forget, somewhere around then.
The dual manual Prophet 10 is truly a collector's item. And I wondered if any of those had been made with the beefier Rev 2 SSM chips. So I asked Dave Smith about it.
That came when we were redesigning the Rev 3. So the Rev 3 Prophet 5 voice card is what's in the Prophet 10 dual manual.
So, in the wonderful world of vintage Prophet synthesizers, you can get Rev 3 reliability and tuning stability, or you can get Rev 2 fatness. Then, in 2017, something remarkable happened. Suddenly, SSM chips were back on the market in the form of Sound Semiconductor's modern remakes. Dave Rossum himself even played a role in upgrading some of these chips, giving them a lower noise floor and other improvements. And with this new development, my friend Jeroen, the proprietor of Analogue Renaissance over in Belgium, immediately got to work on a new product that he laughingly says is the first product to downgrade a synthesizer to an earlier Rev. It's why he calls this kit the Rev -1. But a downgrade it is not. Early on, Jeroen sent over a prototype of the Rev -1 kit, and I installed it in a Prophet 5 Rev 3. It's a pretty simple installation that only requires soldering a single wire, and it's a completely non-destructive mod, no drilling or anything like that required. Not only does this kit replace the CEM filter chips with the fatter sounding SSM chips, it also gives you the option of switching between the P5's 4-pole filter and a new 2-pole configuration. But wait, there's more. There's a second switch there that Jeroen calls Q compensation. To demonstrate what that's about, let's turn to my old friend, the Mini Moog.
Here's a big and beefy bass patch using 3 oscillators with that warm and beautiful Moog ladder filter. Now, I'm going to start cranking up the filter resonance, which the Mini Moog calls emphasis, and what other synths call Q. And as the resonance gets higher, listen to what happens to the low end of the sound. Our fat bass patch isn't so obese any longer. As the resonance goes up, the low frequencies go away.
This loss of bass frequencies is an artifact of the filter design, and while Jeroen was rebuilding the Prophet 5's filter, he decided to improve on this as well. So he designed a Q compensation circuit to bring those lost low frequencies back into the fold. It's done with a 3-position switch. The first position is the normal P5 filter response. The second setting adds half of the wayward bass vibes back into the sound, and the third setting fully compensates for bass frequencies.
I don't know how such tiny switches could make such a big difference to the sound, but take a listen.
Here's the standard Prophet sound. Nice resonant filter sweep. Now let's kick in Q compensation to the first setting and hear how the bass level changes. Now let's kick it on full blast. And finally, let's kick in the 2-pole filter. Analogue Renaissance's Rev -1 kit takes a fabulous sounding Prophet 5 Rev 3 and turns it into the even fatter sounding Rev 2, but with extra filter options. It's like the ultimate polysynth. But wait, the Prophet 10, which is basically 2 Prophet 5s jammed together into one, well, that's kind of like the ultimate polysynth too. What if we could take 2 Rev -1 kits and install them into a Prophet 10? That would be even ultimater, or more ultimate than ultimate. I immediately got on the horn to Europe.
Operator, get me Belgium 34602. Hello, Jeroen, it's Sam. I need you to grab 2 Rev -1 kits and get over here as soon as you can. explain everything when you get here. Oh, and safe travels.
And while Jeroen was packing, we started hunting for a rare Prophet 10. Only about 1,000 were made in the early 1980s. How many would be left 40 years later? Would we be able to find one?
One found us, actually. A nice lady called up and said she had a Rhodes electric piano and a Prophet 10 that had been sitting in her garage for decades. Would we be interested in buying them to fix up? And she was in San Antonio, not even 30 minutes away.
The problem with our new P10, as with many Prophet 5s and 10s, is the potentiometers. You can't really find these pots any longer. And there are two potential trouble areas. One thing is that they have plastic shafts, and these shafts can break if something smacks against one of the knobs. An ingenious fellow by the name of Russ Salerno got around this problem by 3D printing a replica of the original shaft piece, and his repro pieces have saved many a Prophet 5. To replace the shaft, you have to carefully pry the potentiometer open and move the metal wiper to the new shaft. The other potentiometer issue, though, is even tougher. Remember earlier, we said that Dave Smith had the genius idea of using digital electronics to read the position of every potentiometer on the front panel, and then to store that information as a preset. But guess what happens if one or more pots are faulty? The CPU that scans the front panel can't read those pots correctly, and the Prophet 5 can then totally freak out. On most analog synths, a bad pot might be a minor annoyance. On the Prophet 5 or 10, it can render the synth unusable. The P10 we bought from the nice lady had exactly this issue. After fixing a few other electronic problems, we found that some bad potentiometers were driving it crazy. So, for the sake of getting Jeroen's Rev-1 kits installed, we swapped out those pots for ones that are the same electrically, but different physically. In other words, they would let us get on to the noise making, but only as a temporary fix, since they won't mount correctly. And with that, the mad scientist installed his prototype Prophet 10 kit. We've proven that it can be done, but our ultimate synthesizer is ultimately somewhat less than ultimate, since a few pots are just dangling and without knobs. And so we adopted a common repair strategy for such perplexing problems. We packed it back in its case and tucked it in a corner to wait for a dreamy future day with tangerine trees and marmalade skies.
Hi, I'm David Lovering from the Pixies. I'm the drummer in that band, but I love synthesizers. And if you do as much as I do, hit that subscribe button.
It's a tangerine tree.
Look at that marmalade sky.
I think I just had a bright idea. Oh, no, that's a text. Back in Synth Wizards episode 11, we delivered a couple of string machines to Jason Schwartzman. And since then, he and I have become synth bros. And here was a text from Jason letting me know about some interesting synthesizers for sale. One of them is a mint condition Prophet 10. If we could get this Prophet 10, we could pull the other one out of the corner, transfer the Rev-1 kit into the new one, and finally have the ultimate polysynth. Hey, that is a bright idea. One problem. Mary and I are in Hawaii, the Prophet 10 is in California, the money is in Texas, and the seller needs the deal to happen quickly in order to finance another purchase, and he needs the payment in cash. So with reckless abandon, I pulled the trigger. I transfer the money to my sister's bank account in California. She withdraws it as cash, seller drives the Prophet 10 to her, we confirm that it's indeed the treasure he says it is, she hands over the cash, Mary and I fly off to Cali, thank Sis for handling a large sum of cash with a stranger, and then drive the new Prophet back to the shop. Easy peasy. We rented a temporary synthmobile in Sacramento, met my sister in Northern California, and picked up the Prophet 10. It kind of looked lonely in there though, so we went ahead and got a Yamaha GS2 to keep it company, and a Crumar Trilogy, and some other assorted bits and bobs. Now we're in Moab, Utah, heading home for Texas. Once we were back at Syntaur headquarters with our treasures, it was time to get out the first Prophet 10 so that Nick could open it up and remove the Rev-1 kits. The kit simply plugs into the sockets where the CEM filter chips lived, so it's a simple task to desolder one wire and pull the kit out from the sockets. Then, double-stick tape is used to attach the switch assembly to the bender panel, and the kits are popped into the new Prophet 10, one for each voice board.
Oh, that's it.
Awesome.
That's the install.
With the Rev-1 kit installed in this glorious Prophet 10, we truly have an amazing and powerful synthesizer. There's a pair of filter switches for the upper manual, a separate pair for the lower manual so that they can be used independently. And to show off this glorious beast, let's do a quick recreation of the theme music from the Terminator, much of which was done using a Prophet 10. To get the main percussion sound, it's mostly noise, and I also have dialed in a little bit of oscillators to give it a bit of a pitched sound. And then use the envelope generators to get the right type of release on it. Another aspect of it is that I have the keyboard setting turned on the filter, the keyboard tracking. What that means is that as you play higher up the keyboard, the filter opens up more. And so when I play down low, I get a dark sound. When I play up higher, I get a little brighter sound. The next sound that comes in is a low ominous tone, but it doesn't have a lot of bottom end. It's more mid-rangey and a little more biting sounding. So I have the EQ set with the lows down, the highs up. I have a 2 oscillator sound with sawtooth waves going, and the noise is off now. And the other thing I'm going to do is switch into 2-pole mode on the filter. That'll give it a little more of a edgy sound and a little less bottom end. And then I'll just play the note and play the filter at the same time, raising the cutoff. This next sound is a crazy one. It took a lot of knob twiddling to really find it, but it's basically 2 square waves with pulse width going on, and with the polymod working on the pulse width and stuff. And so we have this one dialed in, and I'm just going to fade it in with the volume.
The next sound that comes in is a big ballsy bass patch, and I have oscillators tuned in octaves with sawtooth waves and square waves, and then back to the 4-pole filter, and we just have the envelope set up to where this will fade in nicely and be nice and ominous. And then we get to the main lead sound, which is just sawtooth waves detuned and a lot of reverb. And the right enveloping. So this one envelopes down pretty quick and then hits a sustain level, and it's just a nice brassy lead sound.
I get to wear the wizard robe. But the two Daves who invented the Prophet 5, well, they're the real synth wizards. I was very honored to get to talk to them and very saddened by Dave Smith's passing. He not only designed incredible and iconic synthesizers, he did it all over again later in life with Dave Smith Instruments. And in 2020, he brought back the Prophet 5 as a wonderful Rev 4 reissue and the Prophet 10 as a single manual instrument. Oh, and somewhere in all that, he also invented MIDI. Now that's a true synth wizard.